All right, good evening. Today we're going to get started. We're going to begin. Our topic is going to be, topic for today is early North African history. What happened? What lessons should we learn? And so you see I have up here written out some basic questions. Very simple questions that will help us to look at it. Because if you've had a chance to look at the course outline, you know the first thing is early North African history. So, we want to know what happened, when did it happen, why did it happen, who did it happen to, and why do we care? The why do we care question will help us get into the issue of what lessons should we learn from history. Because as we talked about on Tuesday, you do not study history just to memorize dates. As history teachers, you don't teach history just so a person will know some dates. As a Mwalimu, your job is to make sure that they gain the proper lessons from history so that they can take that information and use it to deal with everyday life problems, to deal with regional problems, to deal with global problems. Your history is going to tell you what your job is today. That's why we deal with it. So that's why they have the question, what lessons should we learn? Because history is there's a personalized component to history. So, we want to know what happened. When did it happen? Why did it happen? Who did it happen to? And why do we care? If we don't know why we care, we could just be staring at a bunch of information and have no use for it. And because that's what we want to do, here's how we're going to begin. Let us begin this session of Hadithi ya Afrika ya Kaskazini with a quote from Amos N. Wilson. I quoted him a lot the last period. You'll hear his name a lot now. Because he was a psychiatrist, well, a psychologist, clinical psychologist, educational psychologist. He wrote an excellent book that all of you as future teachers should read. The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. So you see, the person that I'm quoting was, because he's now an ancestor, but he was a teacher, still is a teacher. Because he's no longer here, but his books are there. And you can go and read them. If you don't have it in the library, stop by my office. I have a soft copy of his book, The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. Because you're going to be teachers in Tanzania. You're going to be teaching African children, black children. That's what you're going to be teaching. You might want to know their psychology. And history is a component of psychology because history is memory, as we talked about. So now, Amos N. Wilson reminds us of what we do not intend to do in our kusoma of Hadithi ya Afrika ya Kaskazini. This lesson is what we don't want to do. And before I forget, each of the lectures will be made available to you starting next week. So that I'll do the lecture and then you'll have a hard copy of the lecture in the event that you miss something as we're going through things during the class. So you'll also be able to get a soft copy from me, or I'll bring a hard copy and give it to the class representative of what the lecture is. So you'll have all of this information, because I'm going to go through a lot of information. I'm going to quote a lot of books, some that won't be in the library. And so you'll need to have that information so you can follow it up. So, what do we not want to do? Because we're going to study history, but there's something we don't want to do as we begin to study the history of Afrika ya Kaskazini. That being, his quote is this. He says, "We see many of us along the highways and byways being very boastful, being very egocentric, bragging a great deal, pumping ourselves up, pumping up even small achievements into giant achievements. We see it even infecting the black nationalist community that buries itself in the great history of Egypt. and the great empires of Africa. Yes, I am speaking of the kind of historicism that has developed in this community as a means of not confronting reality, of people who live their lives in history and dig among the pyramids of Egypt, and dig among the lost kingdoms of Mali and Songhai, and who build themselves a false pride and pump themselves up about the achievements of our history, without facing the perils of current reality and preparing themselves for the future. The black nationalist who makes us feel good and pumps us up and makes us gloat and glow about our great past and does not deal with the present and does not educate in terms of coping with the future and does not adequately prepare us to remove the European from power, to remove these insane people who are about to destroy the earth and life itself. A person who does that is functioning in the interest of the status quo. And those people who holler about the devilishness of the white man, the evilness of the white man, and leave it at that, still are not necessarily performing a full service for our people. There but must be other things involved. We see then many individuals blowing up their minor accomplishments as a means of ignoring the realities of their situation. So the lesson here is that we're not studying history to say, yes, we did this. Yes, we did that, to make us feel good. That is not the point of studying history. We have to study this history so that we can understand our current reality and how to address it. As Tanzanians, I'm sure one of the reasons you came to college was because you want to contribute to the development of the nation. So you have to have an accurate understanding of history in order to do that. And so what he's telling us here, we never study history just to make ourselves feel good. All right, and again he tells us, people would study Egyptian history, but they wouldn't study Egyptian economics. They wouldn't look at the relationship between the economic system and the culture. They are trying to compensate for their personality defect by glorifying their African heritage, which should be done, but that isn't going to solve problems. The purpose of studying history is to solve problems. So, having said that, now I'm going to quote from Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah so that we can see what we will be doing as we study the history of North Africa. And Nkrumah said this: in the new African Renaissance, and most of you are familiar that the African Union has declared this year as the year of the African Renaissance, where you're supposed to be directing energies, all of our energies, toward the rebirth of African culture, African civilization. So, Nkrumah stated this: in the new African Renaissance, we place great emphasis on the presentation of history. Our history needs to be written as the history of our society, not as the story of European adventures. African society must be treated as enjoying its own integrity. Its history must be a mirror of that society. And the European contact must find its place in this history only as an African experience, even as a crucial one. That is to say, the European contact needs to be assessed and judged from the point of view of the principles animating African society and from the point of view of the harmony and progress of that society. So as we study the history of Afrika ya Kaskazini, we are going to specifically be looking at it through African eyes. What does it mean for us? How can this history contribute to what we want to build in the future? So that's what we are going to, that's how we are going to approach the subject. So, to begin, we will kusoma utamaduni mkubwa ya Afrika ya Kaskazini, specifically the high cultures of Kemet, Kush, and Kart Hadash, because we can't cover every last civilization of Northern Africa in the early period. So we're going to deal with the civilizations of Kush, Kemet, and Kart Hadash. And when I use the term utamaduni mkubwa, I'm translating that into the English as high culture, Because as African people, we don't build civilizations, we elevate culture into a high standard, hence the term high culture. So, and we will be looking at the spiritual, social, utamaduni, ikitisadi ya kiasa, and military organization which made them world powers from the years 8000 to 525 BCE. So the itikadi za uhusiano we want to consider are kwanza, umoja, pili, kutendani, tatu, ushirikiano, nne, utaratibu, and tano, upatanisho. Those are the specific concepts we are going to be drawing lessons out of those civilizations. Umoja, kutendani, ushirikiano, utaratibu, and upatanisho. We're concerned with the concepts of reconciliation within African civilization. We're concerned with the concepts of coordination within African civilization. We're concerned with the concept of umoja or unity, and we're concerned with the concepts of kutendana or reciprocity. These are key concepts within African civilization. And since we're studying the history of North Africa, we're looking at African civilizations. We have to draw lessons as to what made these civilizations great. For these are the defining characteristics of these civilizations and of all African civilizations throughout history. But first, let's take a quick look at the region today. On the 5th of December, 2013, as recorded in the newspapers and academic studies of the world, to get an idea of what is going on now, so that we will be able to connect our study of the past, history, to the contemporary time. So I pulled up just about 3 articles from newspapers on the region, so we can see what is happening in Afrika ya Kaskazini now, and we can tie the history we study into that. Because if you understand what's going on now, then you have a better understanding, once you study that history, how now came to be. So, the first place we want to look at is the Republic of Sudan. Alright, this is from June 11, 2013. This issue is still going on today, December 5th. New evidence on scorched earth tactics against civilians in Sudan. The Arab genocide against Africans continues in Sudan. This is from the African Globe. New satellite imagery and eyewitness testimonies from rebel-held areas in Sudan's Blue Nile state show that Sudanese military forces have resorted to brutal scorched earth tactics to drive out the civilian population, Amnesty International said in a report published today. We had no time to bury them. War Crimes in Sudan's Blue Nile state documents how bombings and ground attacks by Sudanese military forces have destroyed entire villages, left many dead and injured, and forced tens of thousands to flee, with many now facing starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Evidence gathered by Amnesty International indicates that villages in the Ngesana Hills, an area held for a time by the Sudan People's Liberation Army of the North, or SPLAN, endured multiple scorched earth offensives in 2012. Witnesses also described bombing attacks as recent as April 2013 that killed children and other civilians. Satellite imagery of the Ngesana Hills showing destruction of several villages. This systematic and deliberate targeting of civilians shows a disturbing pattern that was used by the Sudanese government to devastating effect in Darfur, said Jean-Baptiste Galipin, Amnesty International Sudan researcher. Deliberately attacking civilians is a war crime. Given the scale, as well as the apparently systematic nature of these attacks, they may also constitute crimes against humanity. The report also describes how some people had to choose between carrying their children to safety or carrying their elderly parents to safety. Faced with attack, aerial bombardment, and the prospect of starvation, those who are physically able have little choice but to flee, often after making painful decisions about who among the weakest of their family members should be left behind. This, according to Jean-Baptiste Galliopin. Some of those who were unable to run because of disability or age were burned alive in their homes. Others were reportedly shot dead by Sudanese troops and pro-government Arab militias. In addition, soldiers and militiamen looted valuable possessions, including livestock, before systematically setting fire to houses. Awadallah Hassan, who fled from his village of Kabinit in the northwestern part of the Ingisana Hills, told Amnesty International, "My grandmother Weret was blind and couldn't run. When we ran away, we thought someone had taken her. But we went back to the village at 5 p.m. and we found her body completely burned." While all of this is going on, the world is silent while the Arabs commit genocide against Africans in the Sudan. At least 8 villages in the Ingisana Hills were destroyed in this way and their inhabitants displaced. Witnesses also reported that a further 9 villages were burned down, although Amnesty International was unable to verify these claims. The humanitarian situation of those remaining in rebel-held areas is dire because civilians are unable to tend their crops without fear of being bombed. Food supplies are scarce. Displaced people told Amnesty International that they were often forced to live on poisonous roots that have to be soaked in water for days to become edible. So, that is a little bit about what is going on in Sudan today. So we need to, when we study history, we need to be looking for the reasons why what we know about what's happening in Sudan today. We know about the genocide that occurred in Darfur. We know about the current state of the situation between the Republic of South Sudan and the Republic of the Sudan. We understand that there's a dynamic here. Here we have an African country in northern Africa, and yet in the north, majority of these people who are African identify themselves as Arab. In the south, you have people who know that they are Africans. And we've got a war that if you read The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams, he will tell you this war is 3,000 years old. So when we go back to 8,000 BC and start working our way forward, we need to keep in mind what's going on today and how it began then and how it's continuing to go on. So when you study the history of the past, you need to connect it to the present. So now that's the Sudan. We're also going to be looking at the country that we today call Egypt. So let's look at today in Egypt right now, 2013. All right, black Egyptians decry daily racism. This particular story is from Al Jazeera Network. Always, when someone tells you something, make sure they give you the source so you can go and search it out yourself to see if they're telling you the truth. Because I could be lying to you. So, non-Arab Africans say they are routine victims of discrimination by officials and on the street. This particular story is from Al Jazeera, 19th of July 2013 is when they covered it, and it's still occurring today. So now, Cairo, Egypt. When Ahmed Mohammed first started receiving calls on his mobile phone from an unknown number telling him to leave Egypt, he ignored them. But when the threats against the Sudanese asylum seeker increased and he began to receive emails and Facebook posts with the same message, "Get out of the country," he grew nervous. A member of Sudan's multitude of opposition groups, Mohammed tracked the messages back to a Sudanese embassy official in Egypt and took his concerns to the police. But the Egyptian police officer who was on duty, his response was terse. "Why should I believe you?" Other police stations also dismissed his fears. "No one helps us. They never do," Mohammed said. Black, non-Arab Africans say the case reveals long-standing racism that threatens the security and livelihoods of Egypt's sizable sub-Saharan population. While refugees in the country face an overburdened and highly bureaucratic asylum system, and aid organizations are underfunded and ill-equipped to help them, non-Arab refugees face much more serious problems. You can be here 15 years as a recognized refugee, and not for a moment of that will you ever be recognized legally or have a home, said Christopher Edaz, Director of Legal Programming at Amera, a British NGO for refugees in Egypt. Aid workers believe sub-Saharan refugees are treated by different informal rules than those of Arab origin, excluded from schools, facing hurdles opening businesses and finding work, and hampered in legal cases. A lengthy UNHCR registration processes mean most refugees in Egypt must remain in the country without identification or any means of subsistence for at least 3 years. They are forced into the dark economy, working illegally at cafes, on construction sites, and in other manual jobs where abuse is routine and they have little protection in law, and some are forced into prostitution. Even if you are a recognized refugee and you have a blue card, you have no right to medical treatment, no right to education, no right to work, Edez said. As far as the state is concerned, the refugees fall into a legal gray area where the government has no obligation to provide for them. Egypt is part of the Arab world, and any place in the Arab world is your home, said Reda Sadeh El Hafnour, a member of the Shura Council's Human Rights Committee and the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. They are welcome, but we can't put them under the protection of Egyptian law. El Hafnawi insists there is no racism in Egypt, so if there's abuse, it's from the absence of the law. But aid workers and community organizers say otherwise, and believe not all refugees are created equal. If we skip ahead, we'll see that even the Nubians, who are the original Egyptians who are living in Egypt, they also face racism. So this is Egypt today. So as we go back several thousand years, we need to understand how that history relates to what we see going on today, because there is a connection. And if you read the book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, which talks about the early history of Northern Africa among case studies in other parts of Africa, you will understand that connection. The last place we want to look at is Libya, another area of Northern Africa that we will be studying. What is occurring in Libya today? All right, in Libya, rebels execute black immigrants while forces kidnap others. This is from March 4th, 2011. We have 3 stories here. While much of the world's attention is focusing on crude oil prices and the Libyan pipelines in the east of the country, human rights groups say rebels are committing crimes against humanity. In East Libya, African hunt began as towns and cities began to fall under the control of Libyan rebels, mobs, and gangs. They started to detain, insult, rape, and even execute black immigrants, black students, and black refugees in Libya. In the past 2 weeks, more than 100 Africans from various sub-Saharan states are believed to have been killed by Libyan rebels and their supporters. According to Somali refugees in Libya, at least 5 Somalis from Somaliland and Somalia were executed in Tripoli and Benghazi by anti-Gaddafi mobs. Dozens of refugees and immigrant workers from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Ghana, Nigeria, Chad, Mali, and Niger have been killed. Some of them were led into the desert and stabbed to death. Black Libyan men receiving medical care in hospitals in Benghazi were reportedly abducted by armed rebels. They are part of more than 200 African immigrants held in secret locations by the rebels. In many disputes involving Libyan residents and black Africans, the Libyans are turning on the African and calling them mercenaries. In another story, from 2011, Libyan revolt unmasks lethal racism against black Africans. The ongoing revolution and chaos in Libya has many facets, and some are contradicting others. Alright, despite Muammar Gaddafi's long financial support for black African nations and his impossible dream of achieving a United States of Africa that would include Libya, anti-black racism is deeply entrenched in many Arab societies, including Libya, and that racism has taken a lethal turn in recent months. Uncounted hundreds, maybe thousands of black Africans from countries like Nigeria, Senegal, Ghana, Sudan, and elsewhere have been arbitrarily beaten and murdered by Libyans. This last story, that one was from the International Business Times. And the final story concerning Libya today is entitled Racism and Revolution, the Plight of Black Africans in Libya. And once again, they are addressing more of the same. And this story is from the 14th of October, 2013. And it says, last Thursday, as many as 350 migrants, mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, died as they tried to reach Italy by boat. Why were they fleeing to get to Italy? Because they had been in Libya. Because today, 2013, black Africans are still being slaughtered in Libya. So that's contemporary North Africa today. So if you want the history you study of North Africa to make sense, you need to know what's going on. Why is it that across northern Africa you find black Africans being faced with everything we just read here? And we didn't even talk about Mauritania, where you still have slavery going on. So, now that we've seen the contemporary state of North Africa, let's begin to look at the ancient history of Northern Africa. So, that is the contemporary situation in Africa ya Kaskazini. Now let us begin at the beginning and see how things became that way. Beginning with the world's first and therefore oldest civilizations of Kush and Kemet. Now, when I use the terms Kush and Kemet and Kart Hadash, I am using the names that these Watuweusi call themselves. The people of Egypt did not call themselves Egyptian. The term Egyptian is a Greek name for the people that they found there when they got there. So the term Egyptian is a Greek name. It is not an African name. It is derived from the fact that it is derived from aspects of Kemetic culture, but it is not an African name. So when we address the history of Northern Africa and we look at the primary three civilizations there, we must address them as they called themselves in their language. So when I say Kush, I am talking about what you today call the Sudan and Ethiopia. When I say Kush, in ancient times, you were talking about the people who lived in the Sudan. And when I say the Sudan, I'm not just talking about the Republic of the Sudan and the Republic of South Sudan, but you're talking about the people who lived from Djibouti all the way to Senegal. All the people in that area were considered Ethiopian. When I say Kemet, we are talking about the name itself signifies black people. Those of burnt skin, dark people, black. Because these people were proud to be black. This is how they address themselves as Kemet. In their language, the Medu Neter, which is the Greeks call hieroglyphics. But the ancient people of Kemet, our ancestors, called their language the Medu Neter, which translated from the language of Kemet Kush into English means the words of God. So they called their written and spoken language the words of God. So they're telling you something here. See, when you study, language connects you to a people. So if I say African high culture, well, that's an English concept of it. But if I say Utamaduni Mkubwa ya Africa, that is an African conceptualization of it. Totally different. Because it has different meaning. You're now talking about culture in an African sense, utamaduni. And you're talking about Africa from an African perspective. All right, so I want to clear that up. And when I say Kart Hadash, that is the name, and most of us in here are either Muslims or you're either Christian. Kart Hadash is the civilization that was established in what is today Tunisia by Africans who came from what you now know as Palestine, but who called themselves in ancient times Canaanites. So those people are the people who eventually came across into Tunisia and established the civilization that became Kart Hadash, or what the Europeans called Carthage, the civilization of Carthage. So I need to clear that up, because I'm always going to use the actual terms, the actual name, because you would want somebody to call you by your name. Think back into our own history here in East Africa. Everyone is, we'll use South Africa as an example. Republic of South Africa. Nelson Mandela. His actual name is Rolihlahla Mandela. Why is he called Nelson Mandela? Well, if you read his autobiography, you know when he went to school, he had a European teacher that couldn't pronounce his first name, so they said, I'm going to call you Nelson. I mean, how would you feel if somebody just walked up to you and you say, what is your name? And then you tell them your name, and they say, I can't pronounce that, I'm going to call you Jim. I'm going to call you Mary, because I can't pronounce your name. So you see, when we address people, when we address our ancestors, we address the Wahanga by the name they call themselves, and as much as possible using the language they use themselves. So now, beginning with the world's first and oldest civilizations of Kush and Kemet, Mhanga Drusilla Dungy Houston, an African historian from the U.S., told us in 1926 in her book, Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire, and if you'd like to read the book, I have a soft copy. She tells us that excavations of Petrie, now Petrie was a European archaeologist who engaged in excavations in Egypt, in Kemet, what the Europeans call Egypt. The excavations of Petrie revealed in Egypt the remains of a distinct race that preceded the historic Egyptians. The earliest civilization was higher than that of the later dynasties. Its purer art represents an old race that fills all the background of the prehistoric ages. It colonized the first civilized centers of the primitive world. The ancients called this pioneer ram, which lit the torch of art and science, Kushite Ethiopians, the founders of primeval cities and civilized life. Everything you do today, including sitting in a university, comes from the ancient Kushites. Everything that we do. Every time you go outside and you see a field and it's planted, you see agriculture going on, or you see horticulture, you have the African women of Kush to thank for that. Because Kush was a traditional African society. And they divided things up. So who was in charge of agriculture? Who dealt with feeding the family? Who was in charge of the economy? The African woman. You can still go to West Africa and see the markets are controlled by the women. You can. Because that is the nature of African society. Yes. Okay, that's possible. So when we are looking at this civilization, when we're talking here, when we say Kush, that's what we're talking about. Agriculture, horticulture, everything that we're doing comes from this civilization. This is where it begins. All right. The wonders of India, to which Europe sought a passage in the age of Columbus, the costly products and coveted merchandise of Babylon, and the amazing prehistoric civilization of Asia Minor, or what you know as Southwest Asia, or today the Arabian Peninsula, sprang from this little recognized source, the ancient Kushites. The achievements of this race in early ages were the result of cooperation. Kushites reached the true zenith of democracy. Their skillful hands raised cyclopean walls, dug out mighty lakes, and laid imperishable roads that have endured throughout the ages. This was the uniform testimony of ancient records. Modern writers seem of superficial research, either being unaware of these facts or knowing purposefully ignore them. Generally, these facts were and are still ignored. For instance, you can go to South Africa today, and I'm forgetting the name right off the top of my head, but we're familiar with Mapungubwe, the stone structures in Zimbabwe. But there's another civilization equally as old in South Africa, established by Africans. Well, when the Afrikaners were in control of South Africa, they saw this research, saw what it represented, and then they kept it quiet. They didn't put it in history books, didn't talk about it. So what she's saying here is we can draw the conclusion that this was purposefully left out. All right. Archaeologists dig up the proof. Ethnologists announce their origin, but history refuses to change its antiquated and exploded theories. General history informs us that when the curtain of history was lifted, the civilization of Egypt was hoary with age. It was a culture that must have developed from thousands of years of growth. Why is this scholarship of the world so silent as to what lay behind historic Egypt? No nation throughout the ages has, as a thing, sprung full-fledged into knowledge of all the sorts of sciences. The story of what lay behind Egypt fascinated the whole ancient world. The culture of Egypt did not originate among the lower Nile. Who then was her teacher? It was the ancient Kushite empire of Ethiopians, which weighty authorities tell us ruled over 3 continents for thousands of years. Should the world wait longer to test the truth of these ancient witnesses? Beside these gigantic achievements, the petty conquests of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and of Napoleon Bonaparte fade into insignificance. There seems to be fear to tell about these ancients, who built mighty cities, the ruins of which extend in uninterrupted succession around the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Traces of this hoary empire, works appearing to have been wrought by giants, hearing marks of Kushite genius, have been found by scientists all over the primitive world. So the first thing you need to keep in mind is that what we are calling Kemet or Kush, what we're calling Kemet, begins with Kush, which means it begins further up the Nile Valley. It begins further up the Nile Valley. So everything that, when we talk about Kemet and Kush, all of this, Kemet and Karthadash, all of this grows out of Kush. All of these things grow out of Kush. And that's what we should draw from there. Yes?
All what we can see and witness in most African societies are originating from Kush. But as you said, most African societies, each society develops independently. Now, how far do you take the truth?
All right, so that is the tradition according to African studies as presented by Europeans, that African societies develop differently. As I'll get into in a little bit, you're going to see something very interesting about each of these societies that doesn't make it into the history books. All right, so, and that's when your question will be answered right there. You'll see something, you're going to see something that's going to be brought out clearly. Now, we further know from paleontology and the work of Louis Leakey, and we should be familiar with Louis Leakey, that Olduvai Gorge and the Rift Valley of Tanzania in Kenya is the home of the oldest human beings. And here we're talking about we're talking about the monogenetic origins of mankind. Monogenetic origins. So we're familiar with the fact that human beings originate here in the Nile Valley. I mean here within the Rift Valley in Tanzania and Kenya and whatnot, Olduvai Gorge. Now keep in mind that since this is the birthplace of human beings, all of humanity begins here, and the Nile River is a river that flows from the south to the north. The Nile River, which begins here in Tanzania, was a cultural highway of a multiplicity of African Mabila. Now, so we know that the people of Kush are people who migrated out of the area where we are today. Furthermore, we also know from the find by archaeologist Keith Seal in 1964 of the coastal incense burner This was found in 1964. We know from this it depicts engravings showing 3 Kushite ships sailing to the royal residence. The center ship has the pharaoh with the white crown of Upper Kemet upon his head, and he is wearing other symbols of Kushite nobility. Next to the white crown of Upper Kemet is the symbol of Heru as a falcon, and in the front of the Heru is the Kushite royal insignia. All of these symbols were prior to 1964 considered to be a part of ancient Egypt and having been derived from Asian civilization. That is, until the finding of the coastal censer in an area that nobody argued about the fact that these were Watuweusi. And thus, when they dated it to about 3500 BCE, which means that it was before pre-dynastic Kemet. So, we further know, and now this comes to the question that was just asked. We further know that the peoples of the Nile River Valley who established the civilizations of Kush and Kemet came from the southern region of the African continent, from what is now Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and that both nations were a plurality of African Mabila. This can be seen in the division of the Kemet nation into 42 sub-regions, each composed of a different African Mabila, with different but related languages, different but related spiritual systems, different but related customs. So when you looked at Kush and Kemet and Kart Hadash 5,000 years ago, you would basically be looking at societies which were made up in exactly the same way as Tanzania of today. A multiplicity of different African Mabila. In Tanzania, some people are Haya, some people are Hehe, some people are Nyakusa. You know, you have over 126 different African Mabila here. And yet you're all a part of the nation and call yourselves what? Tanzanians. The civilizations of Kush and Kemet were the same. They were made up of different peoples who were traveling up and down the Nile River. So when you look at the history of Kemet and Kush, and specifically you can see this in the archaeological evidence from Kemet, Kemet divided the nation into 42 different regions. The different regions, when you go in, and you see archaeologists are telling you today that the civilization of Kemet, he said they worship different gods and goddesses. Well, no, they didn't. You had different peoples in these different areas who had different names for Muumba, different names for Mungu. They didn't use Allah, they didn't use God. Those languages didn't exist then. I mean, think about it. So when you go in, Many of us here in Tanzania, we're watching television, right? We all understand Kiswahili, right? But we probably don't know some of the languages that are spoken in Botswana. In Botswana, do we? We don't know every word that's spoken, but we all can listen to say we're watching television and somebody's talking in Zulu. Now, the word for to teach, kufundisha, that's the word in Kiswahili. It's nearly the same word in Zulu. It's nearly the same word. And I could go through another list I have somewhere on my computer that shows you. So we can be watching something from Botswana, and we'll hear a word over here, a word over there. We kind of understand what's going on. You can watch, here in Tanzania, people intermarry across Mabila. So as you intermarry and you start to seeing the different traditions of, say, the Inyakusa, and you see the traditions of the Wahehe and whatnot, you start to seeing similarities, don't you? You do some things the same. Some things are different, but some things are the same. Well, look at all of the Bantu languages. Look at all of the Bantu languages. Bantu meaning human. Look at all the human languages. Look how they form verbs. Look at the infinitive class in Kiswahili. You're going to take a verb, fundisha, and you want to turn it into an infinitive. You put ku in front of it, kufundisha, to teach. Well, you see the same type of formation and structure in all Bantu languages. So this is what you would have found in Kush and Kemet. A multiplicity of different African peoples working and living together and cooperating according to African democratic principles. So they're working together in unison. Because it's impossible to, the whole concept of individualism and independence that Europeans bring, it's impossible to do that. You can't be an individual. Your very existence depends on your relationships, which is why I use the term uhusiano. When we look at African civilization, we have to focus in on relationships. Your whole existence is based on a relationship. Well, if you are an individual, why do you need a name? You're an individual. You ain't talking to nobody. If you're an individual, why do we need language? You alone. You don't need nobody else. So, now, anyway, back to the topic. This can be seen in the division of the Kemet nation into 42 subregions, each composed of a different African Mabila with different but related languages, spiritual systems, and customs, but employing a common writing system and a common language to facilitate trade and commerce and intergroup cooperation. What do you do in Tanzania? What did Mwalimu Nyerere do here in Tanzania? We're going to use Kiswahili to do what? Unify everybody. So you're born in a family and you learn to speak in Nyakusa, in Haya, or Hehe, or whatever. But when you get to school, what's the first thing you learn? Kiswahili. That brings you together. Why do you think you have boarding schools? Some people can, because you bring the different people together into the school. And so, yes, you're still Hehe. Yes, you're still Nyakusa. Yes, you're still Haya. Yes, you're still any of the other groups. But you also develop a new aspect to your identity. You learn Kiswahili, you become Tanzanian. The same thing is what you found in Kemet and Kush, the same concept. Because these are African peoples. See, at the period we're looking at, these are African peoples in North Africa when you're talking about early African history. These are not Arabs, these are not Europeans. No, these are African people doing things according to African rules. So, coming back to your question, you do have groups of people developing, in a sense, independently, but it's in an African sense. Because we do everything by the group. We work within a group. Because we can't survive without a group. If you can survive without a group, then if you can survive without the group, then you know, you'd be born to do that immediately. Look at the animal world. Certain animals, once the baby is born, they don't rear that baby. That baby got to start fending for itself right out the womb almost. But look at it, human beings, when we're born, we spend how long? We spend like 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18 years still needing guidance. But look at African culture. Look at traditional African culture as we find in Kush and Kemet. Guess how old you had to be considered an adult? See, in European society, in America, to be an adult, you're 18 years old. You turn 18, you're grown. In African society, they say you weren't an adult till you were 44. Why? As a matter of fact, some African societies say you couldn't even get married till you were 30. Now, Western science has kind of figured out why these societies said you were an adult at 44 and you shouldn't even think about getting married till you're 30. Here's why. They found when they studied brain development, that's why you need to read The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. When they studied brain development, one of the things they found out was that the part of your brain where you do all of your decision making, it don't finish developing until you're about 26 years old. That's why when you're 21 and 22, you do some crazy stuff and then you're like, I don't even know why I did that. You do something stupid that makes no sense. And then you look back and you say, why did I do that? You know, like you pay money to go to college and then you decide, I'm not going to class today. What sense does that make? You have paid money to do this. And then you say, okay, I'm not going to class tomorrow. So that aspect of your brain where all of that decision making occurs does not fully develop until you're 26 years old. So obviously, the Wahenga scientists knew this. Why else would they say you can't get married before you turn 30? You're too crazy. You're too helter-skelter. You start doing crazy stuff. Think about it. We can put it in contemporary terms. We have AIDS out here. We have HIV. Right? We know this is here, don't we? We know this is out there. So why do people go out and have sex and don't use protection? You know it's out there, and yet, especially at a younger age, you go out and do this knowing there's a possibility. You know it's out there, but you do it. That's because that part of your brain ain't finished developing yet. It ain't all the way together yet. You don't have to believe me. I have soft copies of the brain development, because you're going to be teachers, so you need to know about the developing brain of the people you're going to be teaching. And I have a study on my computer where they talked about the adolescent brain and what's still developing and why they do the things they do. And then they talked about the 20-some-year-old brain and why we do the crazy stuff we do. And then why it's only when you turn 42 into your 40s that you actually begin to settle down. They found out that men become highly successful and achieve their goals after 40. Why? See, there's a reason behind these things, psychological, which the ancients here knew, because they say you weren't an adult until you were 44. Look at many traditional African societies right here in Tanzania and across the rest of the African continent. The Mabila Council is the one that made all of the rules. You were not allowed to sit on the council until you turned about 44. And when you sat on the council, you couldn't talk because you didn't know nothing. What you going to talk about? You have no experience. So you were to sit at the council and learn. Now when you turn 60, then you could start making decisions. But then remember, from an African perspective, to become older is not a negative. Let's go back to these civilizations here, people. All right, so now, these African Mabila of Kush, Kemet, and Kart-Hadash had related languages, spiritual systems, and customs, but they employed a common writing system and language to facilitate trade and commerce and intergroup cooperation. The basis of these civilizations was trade and commerce and control of trade and commerce. The Canaanites, who were the mothers and fathers of Kart-Hadash, they were sailors. They controlled international political economy of their day. They were the shipbuilders. When the nation of Kemet wanted to engage in trade, it hired the Canaanites. It came to them. They were controlling the ships. They were the sailors. They were the explorers. Now, all of this, the fact that there was a unifying language and whatnot, these facts are the basis of what Mangaliso Nkrumah stated in his book, Class Struggle in Africa. Here's what he had to say. He said that Africa is one continent, one people, and one nation. The notion that in order to have a nation, it is necessary for there to be a common language, a common territory, and common culture has failed to stand the test of time. He said this in the 60s. We can see that right now in Somalia. In Somalia, everybody's Somali. They don't got to be, Somalia, everybody's Somali. Everybody got the same religion. Everybody's Muslim. And yet, what's been going on in Somalia for the past 25, 30, 40 years? Massive war. So obviously that's not the basis of unity. Alright, so, and then he says, the test of time or the scrutiny of scientific definition of objective reality. The community of economic life is the major feature within a nation, and it is the economy which holds together the people living in a territory. It is on this basis that the new Africans, us, recognize themselves as potentially one nation whose dominion is the entire African continent. His statement is based in this African history. These people came from different groups. They used a common language to facilitate trade and commerce and cooperation. So that meant everybody's multilingual. They speak at least 2 or 3 languages. You speak your language, you speak your wife's language, you speak your husband's language, and you speak whatever the national language, so you can at least understand it and function within it. Alright, that these people were African, and by African I mean black, is proved by Sheikh who, a multi-level genius from Senegal. He's a historian, he was a chemist, he was an archaeologist, a paleontologist, covered everything. See, because when we're African, we have a simple rule. We don't choose one thing, we become masters of it all. He's an example of that. Alright, this is what he had to say in his paper, Origins of the Ancient Egyptians. Of necessity, the earliest men were ethnically homogeneous and black pigmented or black skinned. Glarger's law, which would also appear to be applicable to human beings, lays it down that warm-blooded animals evolving in a warm, humid climate will secrete a black pigment, melanin. Hence, if mankind originated in the tropics around the latitude of the Great Lakes, right here, he was bound to have brown pigmentation from the start, and it was by differentiation in other climates that the original stock later split into different races. There were only 2 routes available by which these early men could move out to people other continents, the Sahara and the Nile Valley, because at the beginnings of these civilizations in about 8000 BCE, the Sahara is not a desert. It is beginning to dry up, but it's not a desert. The Sahara was filled with inland lakes and rivers and whatnot. And there was a civilization which historically is known as the aquatic civilization. Because it was called aquatic because the main mode of travel was on the river. Alright, so the Nile Valley, when you're really talking about the Nile Valley, you really need to stress the fact that you're following the whole Nile from Tanzania all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And that entire area was a cultural highway. It was how people traveled back and forth. Alright, further details on who the people of Kemet, Kush, and Karthadash were. If you want further details, you need to get Sheikh Anta Diop's book, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. You go to the library, check it out. It's a nice, wonderful, big book. And then if you can, if you know somebody who speaks French, you can go get the French language edition of that book, which is far more extensive, if you want to read further into what we're talking about here. Alright, moving on. Now let us look back to see what did the peoples who were contemporaries of the kingdoms of Kush and Kemet say about them. And remember, I'm going to give you a copy of all of this that I'm talking about here. But what did the people living with them write about them? Ancient North African history. Alright, the Greek historian Herodotus, this is what he had to say about ancient Kush. He says, and he's writing this between 490 and 425 BCE. So he says, I went as far as Elephantine, modern day Aswan, to see what I could with my own eyes. But for the country still further south, I had to be content with what I was told in answer to my questions. South of Elephantine, the country is inhabited by Ethiopians. Beyond the island is a great lake, and round its shores live nomadic tribes of Ethiopians. After crossing the lake, one comes again to the stream of the Nile, which flows into it. After 40 days' journey on land along the river, one takes another boat and in 12 days reaches a big city named Merowe, said to be the capital of the Ethiopians. The inhabitants worship Zeus and Dionysus, alone of the gods, holding them in great honor. The Ethiopians to whom this embassy was sent are said to be the tallest and handsomest men and women in the world. Where the south declines towards the setting sun lies a country called Ethiopia, the last inhabited land in that direction. There gold is obtained in great plenty. Huge elephants abound, with wild trees of all sorts, and ebony. And the men are taller, handsomer, and longer lived than anywhere else. The Ethiopians were clothed in the skins of leopards and lions, and had long bows made of the stem of the palm leaf, not less than 4 cubits in length. On these they laid short arrows made of reed, and armed at the tip, not with iron, but with a piece of stone sharpened to a point, of the kind used in engraving seals. They carried likewise spears. So far, all I have said is the record of my own autopsy and judgment and inquiry. Henceforth, I will record Egyptian chronicles according to what I have heard, adding something of what I myself have seen. And he concludes with, the priest told him that Men was the first king of Egypt, and that first he separated Memphis from the Nile by a dam. After him came 330 kings, 19 of whom were from the Ethiopians. So that is what Herodotus had to say about these people. Notice one of the things he stated, that they were the longest lived of people. That means they had the longest lifespan. That's a far cry to what you read and hear about the region today, where they say we have one of the shortest lifespans. But at a time, we were the people who lived the longest. And considering all of the stuff we go through now, we still live long. All right, another ancient historian, Diodorus Siculus, this is what he said in 60 BCE about ancient Kush. Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men, and the proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest. First, that proof of this of all men. For that they did not come into their land as immigrants from abroad, but they were natives of it, or they sprang from the land, or the term is autochthones, is, they maintain, conceded by practically all men. Furthermore, that those who dwell beneath the noonday sun were, in all likelihood, the first to be generated by the earth, is clear to all. So we can see from this statement that the thing that Umhenga Elijah Muhammad, an African-born and American and spiritual guide of the Nation of Islam, was quite right when he stated in the 1960s that the black man is the original man. From him came all brown, red, yellow, and white people. And Diodorus Siculus goes on to say, he says that they were the first to be taught to honor the gods. They introduced religion to the world, to hold sacrifices and processions and festivals and the other rites by which men honor the deity. The whole concept of worshiping God comes from them. This is what he's writing. And that in consequence of their piety has been published abroad among all men. We're very spiritual people. And it is generally held that the sacrifice practiced among the Ethiopians are those which are most pleasing to the gods. As witness to this, they call upon the Greek poet, who is perhaps the oldest and certainly the most venerated, Homer, in the Iliad, for he represents both Zeus and the rest of the gods. One day they're absent from heaven because they went to Ethiopia to participate in the Ethiopian celebrations to them. Alright, so anyway, so that's what he had to say. Furthermore, the statement was that Ethiopians, the peoples of Kush and Kemet, were faultless. They were blameless. They never did anyone wrong. They raised law and living rights to a high degree. All right, for from all time they have enjoyed a state of freedom and of peace one with another. They practice the whole concept of peace toward all men. They practice this. They put it into act. This is what their societies were based on. All right, so that's what he has to say about us. All right, they also say that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, and Osar having been the leader of the colony. For speaking generally, what is now Egypt, they maintain, was not land but sea, when in the beginning the universe was being formed. Afterwards, however, as the Nile during the times of its flooding carried down the mud from here to there, land was gradually built up from the deposit. Also, the statement that all the land of the Egyptians is alluvial silt deposited by the river received the clearest proof, in their opinion, from what takes place at the outlet of the Nile. All right, so, and geologists today will tell you this, that several thousand years ago, what you now are calling Egypt in North Africa was ocean, was water. And that over time, what is now Egypt was built up from the constant flooding of the Nile. The term inundation means flooding. And that built up the land that you see that's there now. All right, so this is what this particular person writing about these people had to say of them at the time. All right, and he said, the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are, they hold, Ethiopian. For instance, the belief that their kings are gods, the very special attention which they pay to their burials, and many other matters of a similar nature are Ethiopian practices. They came from Kush. For of the two kinds of writing which the Egyptians have, that which is known as popular was the Demotic writing, and then they had what the Greeks called the hieroglyphics, as learned by everyone, while the sacred, or the Medu Neter, was understood only by the priests of the Egyptians who learned it from their fathers as one of the things which are not divulged. But among the Ethiopians, everyone uses these forms of letters. So what he's saying is that in Kemet, the Medu Neter was utilized, the language that they used to write in was used specifically by the learned class, the aristocracy. But when you went into Kush, everybody used this language, everybody read it, everybody understood it. As a matter of fact, once, as we look in a little later, we'll see when Kemet first is conquered, the last conquerors of Kemet, the last conquerors to come through and conquer Kemet and effectively remove Watuweusi from power in North Africa, the Romans, when these people came through and conquered the area, and then once Christianity comes along, and eventually in about the 400s AD, the entire religious system of Kemet is suppressed, you could still find the Medu Neter being read and used further up the Nile. As a matter of fact, the kingdom of Kush was still in existence, still worshiping the ancient gods, and when the Christians who were now in power in Egypt began to oppress the people in Kemet who were still following the traditional religion, the king of Kush took his army and marched in there to stop their persecution. And we have this documented in history. So you can see the utility of the language that the Greeks call hieroglyphics, because it was constantly in use well beyond the fall of Kemet as being a land ruled by black people. All right, so moving on. Now, when we talk about early Africa, Kaskazini, and about these people being African, and by African I mean Watuweusi, when we contextualize this history into world history to understand what we're talking about with these three primary civilizations then, and you put it into the broader global spectrum, we are dealing with African historical memory. in a historical time, the first golden age of African civilization, dating between 8000 to 3200 BCE. When all of the Mabila who inhabited the areas of Utamaduni and Kubwa in the geographical region from continental Africa to the Indian Peninsula or the Indian subcontinent were Kushite and physiologically black in complexion, with the primary difference being that those dwelling in the western extremities of the region, the western Kushites, were generally found to have tightly curled hair. And when we say western area, we're talking about the Kushites who were living in what is Africa. They had tightly curled hair, dark skin. And then you also had the eastern Kushites, and these were mainly people they were dark skinned, but they had straight hair. Still Africans, just got straight hair. And they lived in the lands that today you're calling Southwest Asia or the Arabian Peninsula, all the way into India. So when you put this lit history we're talking about here into a broader global context, you're seeing an African world empire, an African international political economy, an African global trading system in place. Because these three civilizations were based on trade and commerce. And that is a key lesson you must gain. In order for these three to become the powerful countries they became, they utilized trade and commerce. Go back and look at the Quran. Go back and look at the Bible. When you read those books, you hear these nations mentioned over 200 times in the Bible. Because they were the powers of that day. That's why they're mentioned so much. Alright, so anyway, the habitability of this general location being predetermined by climatic conditions associated with the end of the last glacial period, which ended about 10,000 BCE. So, at the time that we're talking about here, what you know as Europe is covered by ice. It's covered by ice and people are living in caves and struggling to survive. While they're doing that, these civilizations are in existence at a very high state of science. And this period is coinciding with the movement of the Kushite Mabila into the region, occurring in small settler colonies. They moved into Europe in small settler colonies. Because we're migrating people, as I said the other day, which brought knowledge of improved agricultural and livestock raising techniques, innovative methods of civil engineering, urban and rural integration, and other aspects of Utamaduni and Kubwa. So when you're looking at this period, these are some of the lessons we should see. What made them so great? They had a masterful system of agriculture and horticulture. A masterful system that sustained these civilizations for over 10,000 years. As a matter of fact, even when these civilizations were eventually conquered, first by the Greeks, then by the Romans, then by the Vandals from Europe, and then by the, as we're going to see, because all of these conquerors come through this area. As all of these conquerors came through, at least through the Arab conquest, this area was still the breadbasket for those empires. Rome turned Egypt into its breadbasket. They were growing food to send it to Europe. Sound familiar? Today, what's happening in Africa? We're growing all this wonderful food, and then we're sending it to the United States, sending it to Europe. Because we still have a colonial relationship economically with these countries. So these are lessons we can draw from this. What made these civilizations great? Alright, and they also had innovative methods of civil engineering. Building cities. We don't need the Chinese to teach us how to build cities and build roads. We've been doing that for thousands of years. And look at it. You don't believe we've been doing it for thousands of years? Just go up the Nile and see it. You can still see it. We build things so perfectly, it still exists. So we don't need them to show us. That's another lesson. We invented the science of civil engineering. All right, so urban and rural integration. These civilizations had cities. For instance, in Kemet, you had a university in Waset. Today, Waset is called, today is called Luxor. The African name is Waset. They called it Luxor, and the Greeks called it Thebes. All right, well, at the highlight, at the high period of these civilizations, there was a university in Waset that had over 80,000 students. Over 80,000 students in these universities. So they had cities, but then they had, the majority of the country was rurally organized. And there was an integration. The cities worked with the rural areas. So if we want to know how can we improve development in rural Tanzania, we need to look back at our own history. We've already done it. You have had many people. Remember, history teaches you lessons. You've had many people. You had Mwalimu Nyerere. You had Sokoine. They said the same things. The development of Tanzania must be based on agriculture and horticulture. Well, guess what, people? The development of all African civilizations throughout time have been based on agriculture and horticulture. And as Thomas Sankara told you, the African woman. Ain't nothing wrong with saying that the woman is in control of the agriculture and the horticulture. Why is that necessary? Who's actually having the babies and taking care of the babies? So who's going to know how much food is needed in the home? That's why our ancestors organized these societies like that. The women control the market. That don't mean, and it's not a case of woman is better than man, a man is better than woman. We don't think like that. We're African. We say that Amen Ra, I don't use the term God, I say Amen Ra, it's an African term, I'm African, so we say Amen Ra, some people say Allah, some people say God. We say Amen Ra made us different with different purposes, but we're still equal. We just ain't same. I can't have a baby, but there are things that men can do that women can't do, but that don't mean that the man is better than the woman, or the woman is better than the man. So we had a system that organized itself that way. And that's what Thomas Sankara was pointing out. Look at Malawi. When Malawi wanted to end its food insecurity, they just did this. In 2003, Malawi was food insecure. People were starving. 2011, Malawi was growing a lot of food. Why? Because the president before, the lady who's president now, I'm forgetting the guy's name. Who? Yeah, Joyce Banda is president now. Who was president before her? Say again? That's it. Him. He had he said, look, we're going to have to ignore what these NGOs and the Europeans are telling us. He said, our people are starving, so we're going to subsidize agriculture. The government is going to be paying for the seeds and the equipment. He said, but we're going to get the money to the women. That's what he did. It's real. You can go look at it. He got a whole speech with him on YouTube talking about it at the UN. This was how he ended food insecurity. He gave the money to the women. The women, he provided the seeds, and not because people, in the African continent, 79% of all farmers are women. 79% of the farmers in Africa are not men. It's women. Women are the majority farmers here in Africa, not men. So if you want to improve food, what do? Give the money to the women. That's what he did in Malawi. And in less than 8 years, Malawi went from not having enough food to having so much food they could export. Now, once he died and you got Joyce Banda came in and she's been trained in the West, and you know, the UN, she was a banker and all, she said, we're going to end that program. Look at Malawi now. Malawi was in the news. I was reading a news article a couple days ago and they were saying that, you know, about to face food insecurity. Why? Ended the program. Very simple. Now, this lesson, we see this in African history. What made these civilizations great? Agriculture was based on the women. It was based on family labor. but it was based on women. Men did plant, but the control of it was women. The main primary crops were controlled by the women. The market was controlled by the women. This is how you develop African society. The example is there for us. We see these civilizations showing us. Because remember, when you talk about Kush and Kemet, you're talking about yourselves. Because those people migrated from here and went there. And they continued back and forth all the time, sending trade expeditions. They were sending trade expeditions all the way to what is today Zimbabwe. You had the people of Carthage in the history books that they probably told you some Spaniard was the first person to circumnavigate the globe, or the first person to sail around the tip of Africa from Europe. No. The sailors of Carthage, the Canaanites, were the first to do it. They recorded it. It's in the history. It's in the documents. They sailed. They contained trading expeditions all the way to what is now Zimbabwe. And they were like, when we got, one of the things they wrote, they said when they got to Zimbabwe, they met the Queen of Zimbabwe. Wasn't the king? Because we don't have a problem as Africans with having women as president. Look at the United States. All these years, no woman president. Look at Africa. How many? 5, 6, I done lost count. So, coming back to where we are here, so now let's go back to 8000 BC. The Kushite Mabila, which inhabited this region from Africa to India, including North Africa, controlled the whole region. They had a written alphabetic system. They had a written alphabetic system. They had a written language. So you can see aspects of the language here. In Kemet, they used Meduneta. Then you move over into another region. They had a slightly different writing system. Everywhere we went, we developed a means of written communication. Why? Yes, we're an oral people and we talk, but why would these civilizations do written language? Because it's when you write, that's how you communicate with the future generations. That's how they can talk to us today, because they wrote it down. And they didn't just write it on some paper, they engraved it in stone. So you could see, hey, this is how we did it, this is how you do it, this is how you do it, this is how you do it. And whether you know it or not, we did it just like that from 10,000 BC until 1800s. What happens in the 1800s CE? European colonialism. What were the Europeans complaining with? It was hard to make these Africans change. Make us change from what? From an economic system where you provided and everybody was healthy, because everybody wasn't unhealthy. And they have studies that tell you this. They changed us from a system where we provided for ourselves and made everything we need into a system where we were sending stuff to other people and not having everything we need. So what you're talking about here, studying and reading here, in 10,000, 8,000 BCE, continued from then until the 1880s CE, with the European invasion of Africa. That's when that system ends. That's when they begin to attempt to destroy it and change it. And from the 1880s, it takes them until about the 1920s before they can get a colonial system somewhat in place. And then from the 1920s into the 1950s, they kind of got this system in place. But then what happens in the 50s and the 60s? Independence. So once you really think about it, colonialism really, we're really not that far removed from what made us great. Oh yes, you do know that in 1900, they estimate that it was like about 200-300 million people in Africa as a result of a lot of the wars and whatnot of conquest. You know, like about 99% of the people on the African continent were not Christian, they were not Muslim. 99% of the people, tradition, African, spiritual systems. It was only between the 1920s and the 1950s that they switched things over, because we were going to Islamic schools, we were going to Christian schools, and so then we started to, we became Christian, we became Muslim. So that whole system, and all of these things go together. the religion, the economic system, they all work together. Keep that in mind. That's what these civilizations teach us. Alright, so now, the Kushite Mabila, they had their own written alphabetic systems and languages which showed kinship in the ancient Kushite language. The centers of Untamaduni and Kubwa Africa in this extensive region were located along the Nile River Valley, the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, the northern coast of the Persian Gulf, the Indus River Valley, the Ganges River Valley in India, the coastal areas of the Indian subcontinent, the southern coastal areas of the Arabian Peninsula, and the African coast. All of these areas, these different areas, were the centers of this civilization. These are water civilizations. Why water? Trade. Can't have trade and commerce unless you got an outlet to the sea. Why do you think Tanzania is so important to Western powers? You on the coast. Not just that you got resources, you on the coast. Not only do you have resources, it's easy to get those resources. It's important. Why do you think that's why they're here? Water is indeed important. You've got lakes here, you've got everything that's necessary for a nice civilization. The only big problem is you got all these African people living here. From a European perspective, I'm not making this up. I was in the U.S., I was talking to someone who was highly placed in government, and he just said, because I was talking about depopulation, getting rid of populations, because that's what I call wars. Wars are a means of depopulating the area. And the guy was like, well, we understand. He was a U.S. policymaker. You know, the ones that the people be happy on the news. You be seeing the folks in the government, they be smiling, the folks be shaking their hand, and they giving them a few $1 million and stuff. This is what this person was saying in the U.S. He said, we understand that Africa is the final frontier. It's got resources and all these things, but you got a lot of people here. So, one of the ways that you can get to the resources is you have to depopulate the area. Think about it. What does depopulation mean? You got to kill off these people. How do you kill people without appearing to kill them? That's what depopulation is all about. Depopulation management. So how do you kill them? Well, you can put in an economic system where people are unable to find work, unable to provide for themselves. That's going to have trickle-down effects. You can have an economic system where people are growing crops that they can't use. They're growing the crops for the international market, so people are starving. See, these are ways you kill people. Think about it. There's no AIDS problem in Europe, but there's an AIDS problem in Africa. You trying to tell me some people just can't pack up, bring the medicine, no more AIDS. Think about it, people. So what do you say? You say, we're going to come help fight AIDS and all of these things. We're going to and then they come here and they get supposedly with this medicine, but look at the numbers that they put in place for you. They tell you they have a grant, we're going to give 800 million USD for fighting HIV. Okay, first of all, I'm in public policy and public administration. So if you told me you was going to give me $800 million to fight a disease, I'm going to smack you upside your head. Why would I smack you for telling me that you're going to give me $800 million to fight a disease? Because as a public administrator, I know 80% of that money is going in salaries and equipment and all that other stuff. Which means you're actually talking about getting rid of a disease with $200 million. How are you going to do that with over 1 billion people? It's impossible. See, that's all a part of the science of depopulation management. See, you see in the textbooks they tell you population management. Just put the word depopulation, because that's what they really, when they start telling you reduce the number of babies, what does that make your population go up or down? So here we are, we got people dying from AIDS, people dying from HIV, people starving, people malnourished and dying from a host of other disease. And then they say, you have a policy put in place, reduce the population, don't have as many babies. That's not natural. So that's a part of these things. Alright, so these are lessons we draw when you look. What made us great? What's the situation now? What's the connection between this? Alright, Mhanga John G. Jackson, an African historian born in America, stated in his book, Ethiopia and the Origins of Civilization, which was written in 1939, he stated that The opinions of Sir Henry Rawlinson are reinforced by the researches of his equally distinguished brother, Professor George Rawlinson, in his essay on the ethnic affinities of the races of Western Asia, which directs our attention to the uniform voice of primitive antiquity which spoke of the Ethiopians as a single race. So we understood ourselves as a single race of people, different Mabila, but a single people. And the ancients understood that in that manner as well. All right, so now, the next thing we want to look at here is these particular places, river valleys, were and are of prime importance given their location next to major waterways which facilitate transportation, trade, and agriculture due to climatic conditions near the coast. Some of the Kushite kingdoms, nations, and empires, which were the disseminators of Kushite, Utamaduni, and Kubwa at this time in African historical memory were in the Nile River Valley, the Utamaduni and Kubwa of Kemet, African Kush and Punt, in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, Utamaduni and Kubwa of El Elam, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, in the Arabian Peninsula, Utamaduni and Kubwa of Canaan, and the Indus River Valley, Utamaduni and Kubwa of the Dravidians or Harappans. Ancient times they were called Harappans, today we know them as the Dravidians. All right, these nations managed to interact with their environment for the most part in a non-exploitative fashion. Sustainable development is what they were doing, so as to engage in sustainable development, and given the several millennia in which these Utamaduni and Kubwa Yakush existed prior to foreign usurpation and destruction, this is truly a remarkable feat of African ingenuity. These nations were a trading network. So these three nations, they were setting sail and trading somewhere. They were trading with these other nations within that area. So what made them great world powers was trade and commerce. Now, the period we're talking about between 8000 BCE and 3000 BCE is a period when the so-called Semite and Aryan Mabila, the Mabila from Ulaya, the Mabila, the Arab Mabilas, these folks had not entered into the region that we now know as Africa. They had not entered into the civilized areas of the world at that time. This is who are today erroneously, but today, because you see them in North Africa today, you say, oh, they built North African civilizations. They built Karthadash and Kemet and Kush. No. They are living there now as the result of conquest, invasion. This is a period when those people were nomadic or semi-nomadic groups living in the mountainous or desert regions and on the borders of the settled agricultural and horticultural areas of Utamaduni and Kubwa Yakush. The Semites were living on the borders of Utamaduni and Kubwa Yakush in Western Asia, and the Aryans were living on the borders of Utamaduni and Kubwa Yakush in northern India. The time period under consideration was a time prior to the gradual encroachment and eventual inundation of the Utamaduni and Kubwa Yakush by the semi-settled Mabila, as there is no archaeological evidence of any violent invasion, but rather of a gradual migration, settlement, missignation, acculturation, and gradual erasure of Utamaduni and Kubwa Africa in Africa Kaskazini in multiple successive stages over several generations. So what are we saying here? We are an African people. There was a newspaper article out of Zimbabwe about 4 weeks ago that said Africa's openness is the problem, because we treat everyone nice. We let everybody in. At this time, when the civilizations were African controlled, African ruled, when world trade was African controlled and African ruled, we allowed the Arabs, we allowed these other peoples to come and settle in our land. And eventually, they took over. How did they take over? For the most part, they just intermarried with our families, the ruling families, and got themselves into positions of power. But it wasn't necessarily always an invasion. This is a period when Africans relied upon Africans, basing all actions in utamaduni mkubwa ya Africa, exhibiting kujitambua, kujithibiti nafsi, kujitegemea, kujitawala, kutawakali ya Afrika, kujiamini, kujistahi, and kujingama amua. Kujingamua, or self-realization. I always have problems with the Alright, and the supreme genius of utamaduni mkubwa ya Africa. This is a long moment in African historical memory when Africans created societies which were so righteous that all African women, men, and children came to be known as blameless or righteous or just. That's the period we're talking about right here. Now, if you want to go out and research this yourselves, you need to go and check the following books. Indiscommon Kush wrote a book, What They Never Told You in History Class. John G. Jackson wrote a book, Introduction to African Civilizations. Sheikh Anta Diop wrote a book, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. Anthony T. Browder wrote a book, Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. Yosef Ben-Jochanan, he wrote, one book was Africa, Mother of Western Civilization. There's another book by Drusilla Dungy Houston, Wonderful Ethiopians of the Ancient Kushite Empire. You can go and read Maulana Karinga's book, Introduction to Black Studies. You can read John G. Jackson's book, Man, God, and Civilization. Sheikh Anta Diop has another book, Civilization or Barbarism, An Authentic Anthropology. Yosef Ben-Jochanan has another book, Black Man of the Nile and His Family. Then you can read another book by Yosef Ben-Jochanan, African Origins of Major Western Religions. Martin Bernal has a book, Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization. And you can read Yosef Ben-Jochanan and John Henrik Clarke's book, New Dimensions in African History. Alright, now, you should check these sources and other sources because you should follow the words of sages such as Mhenga Malcolm X, who said, one of the first things I think young people, especially nowadays, should learn is how to see for yourself and listen for yourself and think for yourself. Then you can come to an intelligent decision for yourself. If you form the habit of going by what you hear others say about someone or going by what others think about someone, instead of searching that thing out for yourself and seeing for yourself, you will be walking west when you think you're going east. And you will be walking east when you think you're going west. This generation, especially of our people, Africans, has a burden more so than in any other time in history. The most important thing that we can learn to do today is to think for ourselves. So you should never have a lecturer stand in front of you and tell you a lot of things and you just accept it. You should research it. And you should consider it within the light of the questions I gave you. What is this person telling me this for? What are they expecting me to get from this? What am I getting from this? What is the point of it all? How is this of utility to me? How can I use this, going back to Mwalimu Nyerere and the whole concept of education for self-reliance, how can I use this not to better myself? That is not the point of education. It's not to make yourself better and get a good life for you and make money for yourself, but it is for you to improve the community. And in order to do all of that, you need to think for yourself. So if someone tells you something, you should want the source. Where did you get that from? How do I know this is true? You can't just take some notes from a lecture. That's why I tell you, I'm going to give you the whole lecture, give you the sources. You want some of the books? I give you the books too. Soft copy. So that you can check it for yourself. Because this is a part of North African history, the ancient part. We're going to look at a little more in detail into these civilizations on the next two class periods before we move into the next period. But we'll look more in detail because it's only by looking in detail that you learn the lessons you need today. As teachers, you want to know, as Mwalimu, you want to know one thing. How do you best teach African children? Because you see, it is not acceptable if you use an African standard of excellence. You have a class and you have 100 people in that class and only 50 do good. If you got a class of students and only 50 pass and you had 100, that means you failed. Because you failed 50 people who came to you knowing nothing. It is never the student's fault. Never is it the student's fault when the student don't pass the class. You came to the class ignorant. If you already knew it, you wouldn't have needed to come there. You can't use the European concept of education which says some people are going to pass, some people are going to fail. That's not African. There is a reason that the peoples across Africa are labeled as Bantu. I say Bantu because it's two words there. Ba, which is a Cushite Kemet word which means the Spirit of God, and then Untu, which is signifying the human component. You put the two together, you get life. So if you say that every person is an expression of Amin-Ra, an expression of Muumba, an expression of Mungu, then what you're saying that everybody has perfection in them, and as a teacher, you're supposed to help them realize it. Which means there can be no failures. Everybody is supposed to master what is going on, or you have failed. And so as Mwalimu, that's your charge. Tanzania cannot afford to have people happy because 50% of these students, you had 800,000 students who took Form 4 and 400,000 passed. Or who took the next, what is it, Form 6 or whatever, they took that test and they say, well, you know, we had 858,000 students took the test and 500,000 passed, or 400,000 passed, and people were like, that's a good pass rate. How in the hell is that a good pass rate? 50% of the people didn't pass. You can't just say, oh, well, 50% didn't pass, well, you know, that's tough on them, they just shouldn't be there. No, that's not how you build a country. That's not what you find written in Mwalimu Nyerere. That's not the charge of a teacher. And you are all in your third year of Bachelor of Education. So obviously you intend to be teachers. And as teachers, it is your duty to make sure every last one of the students who comes to you masters the material. They learn, you teach them to think for themselves. It is important that you do that. And these are the lessons that we pick, that we learn when we study ourselves, our ancestors. This is what they did. So, having said that, we have to pull these type of lessons from that history. What was going on? What made us great? How can we use some of these things to make ourselves great again today? Keep that in mind whenever you are studying anything. The lessons to be learned. How can you implement this? How can you apply it? Not just how can you get have a piece of paper that says you're supposed to have learned it. How can you apply it? Your goal is to deploy yourself, to put yourself out there so you can teach other people so that they can then deploy themselves and teach other people. You're teaching people to deploy themselves so that they can then employ other people and then teach those people they've employed how to deploy themselves and employ other people. It's a cycle. That's what you're doing. So you're setting out and you're creating jobs, and you teach the other person how to create jobs, and then that person goes out and creates jobs, and he teaches other people how to create jobs, and on and on and on and on. That's what you're doing. Those are the lessons we need to pull from this. Are there any questions? Any questions about what we have talked about so far? As I said yes, I have a question. Yes, sir.
For me, just some contribution on the situation on North Africa now, on basing on like place. I mean, now those people are not anymore tenant as we saw in former.
Exactly.
And now most of people, popular people, are more like just are not like push Mabia as we were talking. So I wonder why popular people are really.
Okay.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here, you have one cultural state in place. I mentioned about 525 BCE is when Kemet is conquered by the the Assyrians. And then following this, the Persians, Syrians, Persians. And then following them, you get the Greeks who come in and conquer the area. And then following the Greeks, you have the Romans. And then following the Romans, you get the Vandals coming out of the what is today the Northern Europe up in Germany area. And then following the Vandals, you then have the Vandals come through. Then you've got the Byzantines, which were the folks in what is now Constantinople in Turkey. They come through and they're controlling the area. So what you can see is that with all these conquests, African people do what African people do now. When a war breaks out, people migrate. So the people who were the majority in Northern Africa began to migrate down into Sub-Saharan Africa, back up the Nile into Kush. So then once the Byzantines came through, and we see this as we get a little deeper into it, after the Byzantine Empire comes through and they control it, then come the Arabs. In 640 AD, the Arabs conquer what is now Egypt and all that whole entire region of North Africa, all the way into Spain. And then the Arabs control the area from 640 until about the 1500s or so, when the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, they come through. The Ottoman Empire controls the area from the 1500s until 1914. And then after the Turks come through, then you get the British. And then you have the French in Northern Africa and the British. So you've got all of these different people. So you see some things happening. The population gets lighter in color. And also, you start to see the culture is completely changed. Because now when you go into that region, you have predominantly Arab culture as a result of conquest in those areas. You still have Watu Weusi in the area, but they're no longer in power. You go to today, the Arab Republic of Egypt, and that's what it calls itself, the Arab Republic of Egypt. In the northern part of the country, up in the Nile Delta, you find the Egyptians who don't consider themselves African. But once you get up to Aswan, you start finding Nubians. You start noticing if you I took a train through there, and as I was looking at the train, because trains move slow, you start to notice the population got darker as you started to moving inland. People started getting darker. So anyway, these changes are resulting from a change in Utamaduni. Because when you change the culture, and how do you change the culture? You change the language. You change the culture, you change the language, you change the educational system. You start teaching different things. And so that is why you have the issues you have now. Where everything we talked about, contemporary, didn't make this up, just pulled it out the news. It's there. It's there. You can go and read in there, and you can go and read in more detail. Because I only talked about some of the countries. You know, you've got Niger or Niger sitting right there. You've got Chad. Same issues. They're not on the coast. Technically, some people don't consider it a part of Northern Africa, but it's not considered a part of Sub-Saharan Africa either. Because from that region, the Sudan, Chad, Niger, all the way across to Mauritania, that's where you got the war going on. You've got wars being fought all across that region, basically between Arabs and Africans who trace their descent to Arabs, fighting against the Watuweusi who are still there. I'm not making it up. You can go and check it yourself. Go look at Mauritania as a case study. It's clear. Clear in Mauritania. The Arabs who are controlling Mauritania are in the minority. There's like 2.9 million people in Mauritania. And the people who control the country are like, maybe it's 500,000 of them. They don't want to do censuses because they don't want the Watuweusi in Mauritania to know they're in the majority. And there is a liberation movement going on there. So when we look at this history, what we're going to see as we start to looking through this constant conquest, you'll see why the problems that exist there now exist. Yes.
I have another question. But in your lecture, you said, according to your perspective, that during that time, North Africa, especially when Egypt was an ocean, before that was an ocean.
When we're saying it was an ocean, what we're talking about is when you study geology, you'll see that sometime in the area between 15,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, what you now know as it's the Hora Maquette in the Kemetic language, but today it's called the Sphinx. That was the coastline. Yes.
But as a geographer, I believe that in fact the world was we had a single continent called Pangea, and then as a geographer, I believe there is some series, there's evidence which show that yes, really that it was there between Africa and Europe by using the evidence of jigsaw fit theory that it can really fit, and then just we had those evidence of geological evidence from mountain Atlas to those mountains found in Europe, like and Italy, this kind of mountains. So it's so controversial to say that it was really.
Well, when you're talking about one continent, you're not talking about 15, 20 million years ago.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about the fact that once those continents separated, and when we're saying that what you now know as the Nile Delta was underwater, all of that is after the separation, within, say, about 50 to 20,000 years ago. So that's the difference. You have to make sure, when you deal with these things, make sure you put the estimated time frame with it, so that you can then understand it. Because geological evidence, when they did the experiment, when they did sampling at the Hora Maquette, or the Great Sphinx, that's what they found, is that there was water erosion on the rocks. And yet, if you're there, you don't see any water anywhere around. So the geologists then put together a theory that the archaeologists rejected, but the archaeologists rejected only because it didn't fit into their own time scheme. So that's what we're talking about here, is we're talking about two different time spans. When you talk about Pangea and the fact that Africa was the center of that, that's one time period. Then there's that breakup. That's several million years before the period that we're talking about here, right here with the civilizations. Or what's being quoted in some of the sources when they say at one point what is now the Delta region in Egypt was underwater. So that's what they're talking about. That's the difference. If there are no other questions, I shall see you next Tuesday.